Okay, hello everybody, welcome back to the stream. Alright, so, just to give you a bit of an update on what is going on, I've been having a bit of fun recently because I was looking at what games I had and I realized that one of the games I was playing, Penumbra, I was actually playing the sequel, I wasn't playing the first game. And I kind of went back and forth on, okay, should I go and just instead go back and play the first game and just do a playthrough of that? But it occurred to me that Penumbra, or at least Penumbra 2, was a bit of a puzzle game and it was probably going to take me a while to get through it. And given I've got a few other games that seem to be in the same sort of vein, like Scorn and Soma, which I believe they're by the same company. Like I've got these like puzzle games might be easy or they might be hard. They might take me a long time to get through. I decided to actually watch a let's play of the first game, um, and I've watched it and I've kind of reviewed it, and now I'm ready to move on and continue with Penumbra 2. But I figured before we actually start this today's playthrough of Penumbra 2, or Penumbra Black Death as it is properly called, I figured I would take some time out to actually go over my conclusions. So, give you the review of Penumbra 1 and a little bit of insight into Penumbra 2. So, this is the criteria for my thesis of defining what is Lovecraftian. So, the first one contains a richness of detail that is both precise and overwhelming. I would actually say that the first Penumbra meets that. So, there's 100 years worth of lore in the first Penumbra game. There's multiple, like, you can track the movements of a few different people and the actions of a few different people over multiple generations. Um, there are, even though it doesn't have like, hey, look, here is the picture, like the of a paper clipping or like the information is there, like journal reports are there. There's the front pages, like it's just the straight up text. There's no images, no real fancy formatting, but the details that are there, even a freaking warranty for one of the devices that you use. Like I really felt that it was there, that there was a richness of detail, and it went a bit deeper than just sheer surface level stuff, and piecing together all of that and going, wow, like trying to fit all of what is there and the story of all these different people and what they experience and so on, like putting all that together in the head. Like there was quite a bit there. Um, it's potentially a bit of a stretch to say that it is both precise and overwhelming, but I believe it goes deep enough to meet the criteria. But you'll notice I haven't given it to Black Death, Penumbra Black Death, and the reason for that is simply that we don't see the same sort of thing in the sequel so far. Um, like it is a little bit of a less believable premise, the second one. Um, yes, it makes more sense now because you got captured at something happened to you at the end of the first game, and it turns out you got captured and infected and thrown into this medical facility. But now everything has gone crazy and stuff has gone wrong, and you're wandering around the place, and it's just like, okay, so we just got told that there's a security system. The security system doesn't seem to be doing much. Um, like, you have to deactivate it, sure, but it's just two laser lines. That's it. That's the whole security system for this whole place. What? Um, so it doesn't feel like it has the precise and overwhelming richness of detail. At least not in the opening, at least not in Act One. Whereas I felt that the whole way through Penumbra. Now there are some details that potentially would count. For example, some of the dream sequences, which reflect on. Now I know that they reflect on what happened in the first game, which is kind of how I realized there was a first game and that I was playing the sequel. It was kind of those dream sequences that made me realize it. Like it seemed like there was something going on that it seemed like I was missing information, and I was like, okay, that's why. But yeah, so I do not feel that the current game, Black Death, is meeting that yet. Retells the same story again and again, each time adding more detail. Absolutely, both of them are doing that. A strong sense of realism, except for the element of horror. Again, I'm finding Black Death less believable, but I found that Penumbra, like, that is absolutely true. Even most of the horror feels quite realistic because you're dealing with these rabid dogs for a lot of the game. Um, so I really felt that the sense of realism was very strong in the first one, but the second one, not so much. You start the game and you're already in a sort of fantastic setting. Um, Contains multiple narratives, each with their own natural climax. So I said no to this one, and there's a reason for that. So while you could say that yes, Penumbra has multiple storylines and they do have their own climax, they're not present at the same time. So this isn't just talking about, say, side quests or deeper lore. What this is saying is that there are like two major stories going on simultaneously. For example, you could almost say, I would not agree that this is the case, which is why it doesn't have it, but you could almost say in Black Death there are two stories going on. There is the um, possession factor, like you're sick, you're hearing voices, you've got um, delusions, and at the end of the my last playthrough, I'm not sure if it actually got onto the stream. I think it did, and then I exited. But we start like the voice named itself. Now that is definitely a secondary storyline. The story of this voice versus the crisis that we're in. They are two separate storylines that happen to be going. Well, not just happen, but they are running alongside each other. Um, in Lovecraft, it's often two horror stories. Is the point? Is that you've got, hey, look, here is the crisis that we're facing, and here is the personal horror that is being faced. And they're both horrors. But that sort of angle is more what's going on here. That there are multiple narratives, each one of which could easily be the focus of the story, and or are, in fact, both of them are the focus of the story. And they each have their own separate natural climaxes, and that's a really important point. Like, the word separate isn't in there, but Lovecraft, the climax everything doesn't suddenly wrap up in one climax. A lot of Lovecraftian tales have multiple climaxes. So, oh look, we defeated the thing, it's gone, but there's still 30 pages left. Well, usually much less than that, but there's still, like 10, 15, 20% of the story left to go, because the last however many pages are dealing with the other horror. Often an underlying horror, but so to give an example of this one, with Innsmouth, Shadow over Innsmouth, the immediate crisis, the immediate horror is Innsmouth itself, and then it gets destroyed. That's the first climax. That is the big dramatic climax. We have destroyed the horror, and then there's the reveal that actually the protagonist, like the character who's we're hearing all of this through, they are part of the horror. They are restarting the horror because they have accepted the horror and enjoy being part of the horror. And that's not simply, oh look, I introduced this twist at the end. It reflects on the whole journey, the whole way through. Now, Innsmouth is the easiest to point at. It is not the best example. There are plenty of better examples within Lovecraft. Just they would take longer for me to explain. But the point is that you've got multiple narratives with separate climaxes. They're not all getting wrapped up by the same events. They have separate climaxes. Horror of Dunwich is a much better example. I should have used that one. But moving on. Focus on themes of psychic possession, degeneration, societal and evolutionary terms, the superiority of alien intelligence, forbidden knowledge, cosmicism, and the resilience offered by traditional values. So that was not in the first one. I am getting a sense of it in Black Death, and so I've put a tick there. But I might get rid of that tick. Really depends on how the game continues. But like after we started hearing, oh look, we now have this voice in our heads. It has just named itself. It's touched the box of psychic possession. It may not be enough to actually hold it for the whole game, but at the moment that we stop playing, that box just like, okay, that's actually on the radar. So this one may disappear, but definitely was not in the first game. Might be in the second. Alright, the next one. The reader and protagonist are always one or more steps removed from the horror and unable to interact with it directly. So, for the first one, yeah, absolutely. It's going through the history of the minds, and the real horror you never deal with. You're just avoiding some of the symptoms of the byproducts of whatever the horror is. So that's great. Black Death, not really. Like, and even this one, you could actually even no, you can't. Like, because the dogs themselves aren't the horror, and like you can fight the dogs, you can kill the dogs, but they aren't. They're part of the horror, but they're not the underlying horror, what's really going on, which I don't know what it is yet. I don't know what it is, what the underlying thing that is going on is, but there is something. So we will absolutely see, but again, Black Death, we haven't quite hit the point where that's a thing, but I'm pretty confident it will be. So it's entirely possible we might lose that, but replace it with that. Who knows? Regardless, so tentacles, mouths, scales, eyes, body parts the wrong size, blah, blah, blah. So the first one, no, we never encounter any of that in the first one. The second one, maybe we did see something, but didn't really get a good look at it when I was playing. Maybe we'll get a better look at it when I play further. But it does not quite seem to measure up with that, at least not at present. Something exceedingly difficult to describe to others without sounding crazy, such as a mountain that walks or a combination of contradictory features. This one's almost impossible to pull off in video games because it actually relies on not being a visual medium. This is usually what people talk about when they say Lovecraft is difficult to adapt. Lovecraft doesn't have to be difficult to adapt. If you just ignore that point, this one point, everything else here is easy to adapt. This is the only part that isn't. But because it's difficult to adapt, it rarely gets the tick. So I'm not actually sure if any of the games have actually gotten that tick. I've gone through about 40 games at the moment, and I don't think any of them have ticked that. But when I do the overall analysis and go over all the points, maybe we'll find out that one of them did. Uses specific terms coined by Lovecraft with intent to be read as connected to those other tales. No, neither of them have used them so far. Again, Black Death still might, but they have not done so as of yet. The protagonist should be a blank slate character with minimal personality of their own. So far, absolutely true on both counts. Alright, so now on to the horror side of things. Now you'll notice that Black Death has not gotten pretty much anything at the moment. It's got 1 and this 0.5, which I've deliberately put between them for a reason. So Black Death is actually not doing well on the Lovecraftian horror. It's still a good horror game, mind you, but it's not doing well on the Lovecraftian horror. But let's go back to the top and I'll read through them again. So belittling of humanity, not a thing. Not a thing in the first game, at least. Not in the second yet. Indescribable. The horror must be unseen or indescribable, even if seen. I've given it a 0.5 because while I'm confident that there was more going on in the first game. Like, clearly there was something creating this abnormal growth and creating this 30-year cycle. We never found anything else about that. Like, that, I only established that really based on inference. Like, somebody is studying something. These are symptoms of whatever that something is. But we know nothing about that something. We've got no name, no relationship. All we've got is enough evidence to say, hey, there's something here. But that something could be non-horror. It could be entirely non-horror. And note that this is under the horror section. So there might not be a horror cause for the horrors that we're experiencing. So something is definitely unseen or indescribable. But I don't feel like it's yet been a major source of horror for either game. And I don't know if it will be a source of horror for either game. So I've given it a 0.5 because it is kind of getting there, but it's not tangible enough to have that effect in full. Now, I usually, like, 0.5s I rarely give out. Rarely. A lot of games do get 0.5s. But that's mostly to say, so for example, up here, I might end up giving Black Death a 0.5 for the Psychic Possession storyline, but that's really depends on how it plays out. Is it going to be a major thing? Is it going to be the only thing? Is it going to be... is it even actually going to be a theme? It might just be a passing thing that happens and then goes away. I don't know, and if it's only one of the things on this list, like, this is quite a list of things that can be covered as themes. If only one of these things actually makes an appearance, it might not even be worth the 0.5. So, hence why this might actually even go all the way down to 0. But sometimes, like, things do jump out at me as, yes, this feels very, very Lovecraftian. It's not normally one of my criteria, but this particular thing is really hitting that vibe. So, yeah, 0.5 is usually... It's not quite hitting one of these arguments, but it really is an honorable addition. Or it's... I feel like that should almost be part of the criteria that I should apply to everything else. It's getting at least a 0.5 for that. The second one does happen, but it stays a 0.5 because it's not a big enough point to actually, like, it's not widespread across enough of Lovecraft to qualify as part of the criteria on its own. Anyway, unknowable. The horror must be unknown and unknowable. No amount of engagement will permit comprehension, and whatever we learn reveals very, very little. Absolutely true about the first game. I actually suspect the second game is going to tell us and explain everything. So the second game feels like it's going to get rid of the unknowable. So we'll go from unknowable to known. That's how it feels. We'll see. Helpless. The protagonist must not be able to combat the horror. At best, they can resist it through traditional values, but there is no healing or returning to the status quo. Now, at the moment, yes. In the first game, you can actually fight back. It is very, very, very difficult, both physically, mechanically, and in terms of actually damaging the thing. Like, there are tricks to doing it, but you're not defeating the horror. You aren't, fighting. You're not really fighting the horror. At best, you're fighting a symptom, and a lot of those symptoms cannot be fought. Most of them you run and hide from, and sure, you might have been able to fight this one bit, but the resources you lost from fighting that one thing can make everything else more difficult. And it's just like, yay, congratulations, you killed that dog. It's meaningless. So I felt that really impacted in the first one. But as for hopeless, I didn't feel that the first game or the second game were hopeless at all, at pretty much any stage. It's like, oh no, we're in a terrible situation, but all we have to do is get out. That's it. That's all we have to do. The game was trying to reinforce the idea that, oh, there's horrible things that are about to happen. Because it's written in like as a letter. A lot of the narrative bits are in the past tense, which strongly suggests that we get out. At the very least, we get a letter out. So there's absolutely hope of escape because we've got these letters written in past tense that our character has sent to someone and is telling this story. So it's not simply hope that we get out of this, it's knowledge that we get out of this. Now, the letters do keep saying, oh, and what I was going to face was terrible, and it's the worst, and it's horrifying. We never see that in the first game, because everything that they talk about, in theory, is what happens in the second game. The terrible trauma that the character is going to actually have to deal with never really occurs in the first game. The only time it does, it's right at the very, very, very end. And to be honest, I feel like it could have been done better. It was good, and it was freaking just like the final thing that you have to do in that game. I'll just say it. Spoilers. Spoilers. A man tells, kind of helps and hinders your progress, and when you finally find him, you never see him because he throws himself into an incinerator and asks you to incinerate him, and the only way to continue is by putting him out of his very real misery. And he sounds like a madman, he talks like a madman. I get the feeling, though, that, and this is important for down here, logic of insanity, there is 100% a logic there. We see the devolving, we see the development. I don't think he is mad, but I do think that there is complete logic behind his insanity, even though we don't see most of the points, or many of the points. Whatever the underlying horror of this game franchise is, that is what drove him to madness in a fairly logical and understandable way. That is the impression I'm getting, which is why I ticked logic of insanity, because even if the second one says, nah, that's false, I got that sense very strongly from the first game. But bringing it back to hopeless, we don't do anything that really means that we lose hope. If anything, our successes and the knowledge that we do get out give us hope throughout the whole game. So yeah, I didn't mark it for that one, and for the same reason I haven't marked it for Black Death. I don't think it's going to change, but hey, who knows, maybe it will. Appalling Truths. I marked Appalling Truths again for the incinerator business, and for all the evidence, those little bits of evidence that we collect along the way. We don't understand it. We haven't got enough evidence to understand even a fraction of it, which really plays into the unknowable and helpless sort of things. Like these four things are work together really freaking well in this game. I'm still pretty convinced that the second game is gonna make it known. The appalling truths probably won't be so appalling. The unknown will become known. What is indescribable will be very, very described, and or seen. And it's entirely possible that that strong sense, that logic of insanity that I talked about earlier, the second game may get rid of all of that. So I'm not actually too hopeful that, like, Black Death looks like a good game. I am enjoying it, but I'm not too hopeful that it's gonna strike many of the points of Lovecraftian horror. The last 2 points, part of the horror should be fueled by real-world stereotypes held by the audience to help build the horror and suspense. Typically an ism of some form, but not necessarily so. Again, this is one of those things that, sure, you can put that in a video game, but why would you? Just why? But Lovecraft does it all the time, so it is part of the criteria for defining Lovecraft. And it's one of those reasons that you go, maybe we shouldn't make a Lovecraftian game if we have to include that. And the answer is you don't have to include that. But, importantly, this game did not do that, and has not done it to my knowledge. Again, Black Death could change that, but so far has not done any of that. the last point, the only salvation may be found in the resilience offered by traditional values, but it only delays the inevitable, it does not offer an escape. I felt like it was a thing, but it wasn't much of a thing. So it really felt like whatever's going on in these games, like particularly the first one, yes, it's a secret, it's kept hidden. Um, it's hard to argue that it's traditional values that are forming the bulwark, that are creating that resilience. But that though there's it's constant reinforcing of the desire to leave and certain creature comforts of, hey, I recognize this. This gives me hope and comfort at various points in the game. Um, it feels like it does touch upon this. It doesn't feel like it's a big part of it, but it does feel like it touches upon it. And it's worth noting that while this is a part of the criteria for what makes something Lovecraftian, even Lovecraft isn't particularly heavy-handed with this. It is there if you look for it, but it's not simply that it's easy to overlook. It's one of those things that just it blends into the background. It's like the blank slate character. So blank slate characters are often, but not always, synonymous with the concept of an everyday man. And that concept has thrown me a few times, even in this review, because I've got blank slate character here, but it really should be everyday man. But it's also specifically a Lovecraftian everyday man, which is, you know, white collar or respectable blue collar, a white man, middle to upper to lower upper class, um, you know, highly educated, at least has 1 degree or some equivalent thereof, which in especially in Lovecraft's day and age, that wasn't a lot of people. That was not a lot of people. But that was the standard quote unquote everyday man of literature of the time, and especially Lovecraftian literature. So, what, like blank slate and everyday, blank slate is supposed to be the audience can easily slip themselves into that character, and the player's choices and the character's choices feel like they're very much the same thing. And being blank slate means that the character's personality, choices, and actions have a minimal impact on that and minimal conflict with the player. Which some games do and some games don't, and some games don't even try. They just don't give the entities that the player plays character at all, which definitely does not fit the mold of an everyday man or a blank slate character if they have nothing. Um, but yeah, like a lot of the time, coming back down to this one, the concept of the only salvation can be found in the resilience offered by traditional values. A lot of the time, it's one of those things that you won't notice unless you already know those traditional values, and if you already know those traditional values, you won't notice them because you're culturally blind to them. A really good example of this is actually, I believe it was Dagon. I'm 90% certain it's Dagon. That made this whole thing famous. Is the protagonist who commits suicide at the end of the story, in order to escape everything. He is taking laudanum and had been drinking to try and escape the horror that were plaguing his mind. But it's important to say that it wasn't working. The laudanum and the alcoholism were historically, like in Lovecraft's time, and especially for Lovecraft himself, that was supposed to show that this man was scarred and he was failing and he was just engaging in anything and it was failing and it was terrible. It wasn't helping him resist, it wasn't giving him salvation, and it was not delaying the inevitable. Um, and that is really important because people often take the wrong message, and you often see in quote unquote Lovecraftian games or in like the role playing games or whatever, hey, you can totally drink this alcohol and it will restore your sanity. No, Lovecraft actively said the opposite. He said, in a lot of his writing, oh, you drink the alcohol? Cool, now you're going even more insane. It's a foolish gesture that actively makes things worse. The only resilience in his stories is the traditional values. And for the most part, those traditional values are at the start of the story because that's about the social constructs that separate us from the horror. Once we're exposed to the horror, um, you know, it's inevitable, but you can cling to some part of traditional culture, to some part of your life before to try and retain some semblance of sanity, some ability to talk and engage with other people. Um, but it delays the inevitable, and you see that in a lot of the side characters, who, some of them that tell the story are still clinging to some element of the traditional values that Lovecraft himself was trying to put forward. They're also not Christian. Lovecraft was very, very, very materialistic in his philosophy, and this is where a lot of that materialism comes through in the concept of traditional values. Um, and this is also a big part of why salvation isn't possible, because that salvation is a fiction, and it's a fiction peddled by faith, according to Lovecraft, and that is either actively makes things worse or is a tool for making things worse. Um, and it's the materialism that is the real bulwark, that is the real resilience, the real ties that bind, and all that sort of thing. So there's a lot of conversation that can be had on this concept on its own. But bringing it back to Penumbra, specifically the first game that I'm talking about, a game that you may not have watched play. Go watch a Let's Play of it if you should have said that at the start. But the only salvation that can be found is resilience offered by traditional values. I feel like it is there, but I don't feel like it's enough to be at a point on its own. Um, and again, matching it up with the indescribable, I think that the two of them together are enough to guarantee a 0.5 for Penumbra. So that's not two, that's not, those two don't get combined to add an extra one. Like, there's not enough in either of them for that. But the two of them combined, I think, would be enough to give this as an extra 0.5 rating, which would be, what, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It would be 9.5, which is actually really pretty good. So, that ends up being somewhere around here. I'll actually put it on the pyramid later. And the reason I haven't put it on the pyramid yet is because I actually want to finish... whoops, that shouldn't exist. That was from a previous game and we've done all that. Anyway, that's the pyramid with a few games on it. Yeah, the reason I haven't put it on yet is because it's clear, because the first one was called Episode 1, it's clear that so much of Penumbra 1 was tied up on being a build-up for Penumbra 2, for Penumbra Black Death. Penumbra Overture, by the way, is the name of the first game. So I feel like I should play... Like, if I were to just judge Penumbra entirely on its own, which ultimately is how I will do it, it's going to get a 9.5. But I want to put it on once I've played through Black Death, just in case maybe there were some details that I missed in Penumbra that upon reflection after playing Black Death, I'll realize, oh, wait, that was a thing. That was something that I should have marked at the time. I doubt it. I strongly doubt it, but it could happen. Regardless, that is the review as it stands for Penumbra Overture, and the little that we have for Penumbra Black Death. Please do recall... Oh, that should be gone. That doesn't matter. Do recall that we haven't finished Penumbra Black Death. In fact, I'm only like an hour in, and it's like that's maybe 10% of the game, I think. Basically, we've just done Act One. Um, so yeah, like there's still a lot more to go, and a lot of these points could change for Black Death. Some may go up, some may go down, but that's where it is at the moment, and that's where Overture is. So, uh, without any further ado, I'm going to stop this stream and I'll put this on YouTube as just as a flat out review of the two games as they stand. And then when I start the next stream, we will be getting straight into Penumbra Black Death. See you in a moment.